All right. Well, welcome everyone to the December Positive Psychology and Masculinities interview. We are really fortunate today to be joined by Sam Swisher. Sam is a doctoral psychology intern at Cook Counseling Center at Virginia Tech. He brings a wealth of knowledge and passion to his work, particularly in the areas of foundational counseling techniques, clinical supervision, and training of clinicians. But one of Sam's standout areas of expertise lies in men's friendships. His work sheds light on the complexities of men's relationships. He offers valuable insights for practitioners and for researchers in the work that he does. Please join me in welcoming Sam Swisher.
Hey, everybody. It's good to see everyone.
Well, thank you for being here, Sam. So, we're going to start kind of broad and general because, again, this is a positive psychology series. So, as psychologists and counselors, why should we care about friendships?
Yeah, I um I think it's an important aspect of well-being. Um, friendship is just one of the many ways that people gather social support, but it's also one that offers kind of something special. Yeah, early researchers in the area of friendship talk about how it offers things like ego support, how overall, it allows people to get practical support from others, um, things like that. And ultimately, it's also incredibly impactful for mental health. So what we know is that um, people who aren't getting social support aren't engaging with friends. It's a characteristic sometimes of depression, and the other way around. So people who are experiencing, um, are experiencing loneliness, oftentimes experience depression as well. So it's a huge part of mental health. Um, so yeah, that's it should be part of kind of I think for me it's a really important part of assessment with clients. I know when I sit down with a client and I start getting them talking about social support, when I see that they have a friends, and they light up talking about that, I know that my work gets quite a bit easier. And I think that is supported by the research, that it is an important part of well-being and mental health.
But what I really love about what you're saying is that when we're doing this work clinically, you're really setting the standard for taking those intake questions around things like social support and actually bringing them into the room in a meaningful way rather than just checking the box of I asked about social supports or I asked about relationships.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think it's important to follow up with that. We want to know for as a clinician, I want to know my client and I want to know my client in their social context. A lot of times that allows me to know that my clients are getting feedback that they need from friends, and that makes my work different and my work also easier. And so I think it's an important part of assessment. And I want to, right, when that comes up, when they talk about friends, when they talk about social support, right out of the gate, I want to prioritize that as a clinician. I want to show them that I think that's something that's important. So yeah, that's what I try to do from the very start.
So, what led to your interest in focusing more specifically on men's friendships?
Yeah. So I've had a long desire to do work on well-being. Living well matters to me. Um, as a person, friends with men, friends with women, um, friends have helped me be the person I am. I couldn't do what I do, I wouldn't be who I am. Um, and so it's something that I'm just deeply passionate about. Um, and the part of men's friendships that really interests me, and I think a lot of people who do research and think about identity is what brings you in is the complexity of it. And to me, I think men's friendships are so complex. Um, I've had a lot of really close male friendships, um, and I've experienced this type of intimacy and support. The humor that we sometimes see with it, and it's just so beautiful, and it's like this different type of intimate. There's also been times where I'm kind of disappointed by it, and I realize part of that's on myself. Um, but part of my desire to do this research comes from trying to understand them, trying to push back on that. Um, I think particularly at this time too, it's not just about men, but across the board in the United States, isolation is up. The amount of time that people spend with friends is dramatically declined. Um, Survey research shows in the year 2003, people spent about 60 minutes a day on average with friends. And just prior to the pandemic, we were looking at 34 minutes a day on average.
Wow.
That's a pretty dramatic drop. Um, and I think that doing something about that, addressing that, given the gendered nature of friendship that we see, requires a gendered approach to addressing it. And so, yeah, that's kind of what draws me in. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're really talking about bringing in your own lived experiences, things that you noticed clinically, things that you were noticing in the research. And on that note, you recently completed a very comprehensive review of the literature on men's friendships. I guess I'm curious to know what surprised you the most as you read through the literature.
Yeah. Um, I think I did do a pretty big search. I think I had 1,200 articles. Yeah, 1,200 articles at the start. Um, when it came down to moving through those articles in my scoping review, I was kind of surprised by the final review had 40 articles because I was looking specifically at research that talked about men's friends with other men. Um, no time, no date restriction. I was kind of surprised that it came up that few. I'll be honest. Yeah, we've known that friendship, the intimacy of friendship is gendered for a long time, and it was kind of surprising to see that not as much focus has been done there. On kind of a different note, if anyone's ever looked at the public health research, the Australians are just doing great stuff. I know that's kind of an odd thing to take from a scoping
So
review, but
true.
it's really is amazing. And they, a lot of the research looks at um, that I saw from Australia looked at it really allowed for gender to be because it's one thing to look at the research on do research on men's friendship thinking about gender as a variable that impacts the relationship, but it's kind of different when you start thinking about the friendship as a stage in which masculinity is performed. And I felt like there's been more of that in the last few years, but there needs to be more. And I felt like the Australians had some really good stuff to say about that. Of course,
This has been
yeah,
an ongoing trend that we've noticed that, especially when it comes to things like healthy masculinity
yeah,
or focusing on, constructing more positive masculinities, the Aussies seem to be at least 10 years ahead of us in the US in terms of outreach and research. And so I'm not surprised to hear that that's clear in the friendship research as well.
yeah,
So let me ask you, I mean, based on what you've noticed anecdotally, based on what you've seen in the reviews of the literature, what are some of the most common challenges that men encounter when trying to form close friendships?
yeah. Um, I know I touched on kind of how it's part of a larger trend. Um, what I've noticed is it's just hard out there. And as a clinician, that's the thing I always hit first is making friends, maintaining good friendships, deepening friendships. It's not easy work. Um, people are pulled in a lot of different directions, work, family, um, things like that. Uh, you know, um, some people work 60 hours a week. the research shows that one of the main the sure thing to get in the way of having more social support is having less time to do it. So people are pulled in a lot of different directions. It's also, it is complex. Having and maintaining social relationships is tough. It takes a lot of cognitive effort. Um, so I want to put kind of, yeah, like what's tough for men in friendship in that broader context. Um, and then ultimately, I think what masculinity does bring to the table often doesn't make it easy. Um, you can look at, kind of different lists of traits we associate with traditional masculinity. Um, they're going to include things like emotional restriction, emotional control. Um, that's not something that's going to be, it's helpful in certain circumstances. It's not going to be super helpful when it comes to being vulnerable and building friendships. So that kind of thing. Any sort of like attachment to being powerful or being seen as powerful, dominance. That's a pretty tough thing to bring into a friendship. You can kind of watch men navigate that in different ways, joking and things like that. But it's ultimately probably not something that brings men closer to one another, closer to friends in general. Um, and then the final thing is, and this depends a little bit on people's different conceptualizations. But I'm kind of the opinion that intimacy itself in the United States is labeled as being somewhat feminine. And when you throw anti-femininity, which is kind of in some ways a hallmark of traditional masculinity, it just gets a lot harder. It just gets a lot harder. Um, you know, so yeah, those are kind of the major barriers that I see, and that pattern's been happening so long that sometimes it's hard to find role models, or even if, other groups of men or people who are willing to kind of work with you if you're demonstrating some of those things.
You raised some really important points. I love that you're situating all of this within this context that it is hard for everyone for a
Yeah.
number of reasons. As we think about changes in how we socialize, as we think about economic factors that reduce the amount of time that we have to spend with one another, we think about the ways that work has evolved, and then you add on that layer of gender role socialization, and are certain behaviors allowed or not allowed within male friendships. A few of us were on a workshop earlier today that was talking about this idea that a lot of men are trying to practice socializing using AI because of the fear of rejection and being uncertain about what intimacy looks like, and they're just layers and layers of challenges.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really great point, and that kind of AI, the use of AI is a great example. I was talking to a colleague the other day, and she was like, "Oh, Monday morning, oh, I have 4 clients on my schedule. All guys have difficulty talking about their feelings," and she said, interestingly, every single one of them tried out talking about their feelings with their older sister. It was one of their first steps, and of course that's anecdotal, but I see you smile, Dr. Hensley. Yeah, older sisters are magic. So, trying out, like figuring out how to do that, maintain that. My heart goes out to guys who really are feeling socially isolated. It seems that social isolation is happening more. There's something gendered there. Men are more socially in the extremities of being socially isolated. Um, and yeah, likely gonna have to practice some of those skills with family, AI. It was gonna be helpful. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Another thing that seems to jump out at me as as you talk through this is this idea that there aren't always a lot of great models for boys to
Yeah.
use as they try to figure out how to navigate friendships as they grow up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do friendships seem to change with age for men?
Well, undoubtedly so. I I always admire children being able to pull off the just meeting someone and say, will you be my friend? Which is kind of how, I don't know, Dr. Cole, is that like 3, 4? It's, we are socially, we're wired to make social connections.
Mhm.
And you see that so clearly with children. Undoubtedly, somewhere along the way, we get a little bit, maybe a little more aware,
Yeah.
maybe a little more mindful, suspicious even. Um, but yeah, so things change, undoubtedly.
I, that
Yeah,
example of early childhood. So yesterday I had lunch with one of my best friends in the world, and we sat next to each other in alphabetical order in kindergarten. And
yeah,
that's how we met. And we became best friends at circle time,
yeah,
and we're still best friends.
yes, yeah,
It's a lot easier, I think, for
yeah.
boys in that way, or for kids in general.
It really is. And yeah, so my current dissertation, I'm interviewing men about their friendships, male friendship dyads. And that's kind of something I'm seeing is like, yeah, that sometimes that formation is made easier by the sports that you engage in high school, middle school, high school. Um, that's a great place to start making friends. That common, right? We know that there's kind of something about seeing people regularly that allows for the formation of things to go deeper later on. And so there's that structure that children, adolescents are often given, makes that easier as well. Yeah, yeah,
So, so related to that, I know you did some research on how men found connection during the pandemic. Um, when that structure is not in place, what are things that men can do to try to facilitate that?
uh, it's tough. Right, I'm going back to that again, and it was hard. Um, it's gonna take, I think it takes on the front, it takes vulnerability when you're doing the friendship. And I think it takes vulnerability on the front end of acknowledging I'm a being that needs social connection. And that's kind of the first step, in my mind. And then the next is trying to find things that are regular. Um, I've looking at my life, I've had to move a lot and make new groups of friends. Um, kind of I've always kind of been striving to make sure that to make weekly rituals with friends of hanging out where it's the default. Um, it's when it's Thursday night, everyone's gonna be here and we're watching a movie. Like the the regularity of it is very key. Um, and then when when you have that opportunity to take things deeper, taking that risk is going to be really important. Um, at some point, you got to kind of move into the, hey, I know I don't usually talk about this kind of thing, but I wanted to share something about myself. Um, opening the door up, opening yourself up and being vulnerable is just really key. Um, yeah,
What kind of advice would you have for helping guys to do that?
yeah. Um, I think practice is important. We find that research shows that family relationships are more stable. Um, they'll be maintained without sort of the same constant maintenance often. So I think trying it out with family, if that's safe, um, I think that's important. Um, there's also research that shows that typically when people share things, it goes better than they expect. And so as a clinician, I'm pretty quick to remind people of how that is helpful. Um, ultimately, man, you got me here, Dr. Cole. I think there is like an element of at some point you do just have to do it, and you have to realize the butterflies in your stomach and you doing what you're going to do despite that. Um,
So as you're encouraging guys to do that, I mean, for some guys, they haven't done that.
yeah,
They don't know what that would look like.
yeah,
So I mean, is there some scaffolding there, or do you just like rip the band off and say, go spill your guts?
yeah. Well, so as a clinician, I role play this kind of thing with clients. I'm a huge fan of there's Christine Podesky. She does like for specifically for social anxiety, but I do role plays with clients. Slow, kind of that habituation to the stressful, anxiety producing nature of that. That's what I do kind of clinically.
Mhm.
Kind of explore how, sharing with me, how did that pan out? Like, how did you feel when you started doing that? And be validating of their fears. The one thing I always go back to is, um, and I'll do this alongside clients, is how profoundly violent and harmful early policing of masculinity is. And I can meet a guy and because they were a guy, I can meet a guy who's raised in the United States, and I can know because they were a guy raised in the United States that they've experienced that of being told that they're not a man enough. And sometimes it's habitual, sometimes it's a one-off, but though pretty much every guy can remember being told that. And so kind of in having them question that, is that what I want for myself? Is that something I believe? Sometimes that can help get them to kind of a little more of like a critical consciousness space,
Mhm.
kind of questioning the impacts of patriarchy on themselves. That's a direction I go as well. Um,
It sounds like an important component of that is helping men to understand that there might be places where this feels easier to do, or places where it feels safer to do, or maybe even topics that this feels safer to go about being vulnerable about, rather than it just being a everything with everyone all the time kind of thing.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Um, and trust yourself. Like trust yourself. You know the people, people you're gonna have some idea of how they're gonna respond, who's coming up for you, that kind of thing. Yeah. Just kind of trust yourself. The other part of it is I think on some level it should be anxiety provoking. Um, when I reflect on the times I've shared really vulnerable things with people, one of the things that comes to my mind is they never responded exactly how I thought. Never, never once. And also that's what makes, like, if this is happening in the context of friendship, that's what makes that friendship special. Um, and so kind of sharing, I share that experience. I've shared that experience with clients. Um, hey, you're not gonna know, and that's scary. And it's also really exciting that you're gonna get to know your friend better based on how. That's, I don't know. To me, I'm getting excited just thinking about that. But that kind of thing gets me.
There was something really subtle that you just said. This
Yeah.
idea that you're going to get to know your friend in this new way, like you're gaining something, right? So yes, there are risks,
Yeah.
and we've been taught through police masculinity about all the risks, but we don't talk enough about what you could gain.
Oh, yeah. 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 I get shivers. Yeah. It's so powerful. I had a participant share that getting to know his friends, he's learned to love their feelings. That kind of thing's so beautiful to me. It's those tough conversations where you're gonna feel held in a new way, very likely. Um, and it's gonna open up reciprocity. I've seen that in person. I've seen that. I have a group chat of guys from home, and I've been always surprised of how well vulnerability is received, and how it brings out the best in people. I had a friend come out as gay to a group chat, and another friend came out and came and apologized for like saying homophobic things in the past, and was like, I don't want that to get in the way of how much I care, like basically how much I care about you. It's just like, that kind of thing. You know, everyone like rising tide raises all ships. That taking the risk, taking that vulnerability, can move friendships into a new stage. It can move you and your friends. It's yeah, yeah,
So you've had some great thoughts about how men can deepen their existing relationships. I know we've kind of alluded to things like intentionality and scheduling and
yeah,
structure, but do you have other thoughts about practical ways that men can build friendships from the ground up, maybe when they don't have that social support in their lives?
yeah. I So seemingly one of the nice things about, and I try not to get into like men versus women's friendships too much, but there's a really interesting article from 2003 that talks about social support and how men have a different understand when they were um, breaking down this measure, and they found that women had a global understanding of support, just one factor, and men ended up having this practical and this emotional factor. They kind of saw those as being potentially different things. Um, and I think although it's that, I think it also extends to other things. Um, One of the words that keeps coming up in my interviews with guys is excuses.
Hmm.
Um, the idea that the thing we are doing is an excuse for friendship to deepen. Um, and so thinking about, yeah, the hobby might just be the hobby, and slowly it develops into friendships. Um, we golf together. It's not about Honestly, it's not about golfing, right? Um, I always need we fix cars together. It's not about that. I want some business advice. I'm calling you, but we're gonna have other conversations too. Um, so yeah, getting out, doing things regularly, hobbies, interests. Um, I was talking to a client pretty explicitly about this topic, and I think there's also you got to temper somewhat expectations. It's another part that's hard. The the A good, meaningful, deep friendship is the end zone. But you got to be thinking about first downs, and that's seeing the person again. That's putting in those hours, right? We know it takes hours to move from acquaintance to friend to good friend. Um, and so putting in that time. Um, yeah. Does that answer the question sort of?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I want to maybe pull you in a slightly different direction for a second. So, you've got this really solid background in positive psychology and in men and masculinities.
Yeah.
And you're familiar with the positive psychology, positive masculinity model. And a couple of the components of that model just are jumping out and screaming at me as we've been having this conversation. And those are, the role of shared activity, which you've just alluded to now a few times, like
Yeah.
golf or fixing cars or getting together to go to a game or whatever those things might be. But
Mm.
also they talk about the role of fraternal organization,
Mm.
the idea of like community and civic involvement and clubs and things like that. Um,
Church. Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about that idea of like fraternal organizations or just community organizations in person or online as a means of connection?
I think it's so helpful. I mean, the bigger we talked about like the last 20 years, the bigger context for the United States. Um, if you get into the history of, yeah, fraternal organizations in the United States really hitting a heyday in like around the 30s. I think about this in my personal life. My grandfather was a member of 4 different fraternal organizations in his town.
Wow.
And that's, yeah, kind of like not something that you see so much anymore. Um, I think it's, yeah, tremendously beneficial. The research shows that people who attend church regularly often live longer, and part of that is, right, like doing the physical activity of going, and but the social support too is immense. And there is something really, right, like with the decline of religiosity in America, that is pretty sad about, people missing that. Um, Yeah, I think, right, we're talking about, I hear you talking there about like positive institutions.
Yeah.
Um, I I think there's just a lot of, I haven't delved into what is out there so much, but there's so much that like that's the research that, if I could see any positive psych research, that stuff excites me so much. How does this one fraternal organization, like, how does that brought people together? How does that shape their life histories? I think there could be really interesting like narrative approaches to that kind of research. Um, yeah, and I think also, you know, you always, I think you quote Shane Lopez really well, Dr. Cole, saying like people only look for what they know to look for. And that's one of the most amazing, for me, like I practice therapy from a more humanistic perspective, but that's what I love about positive psych is it gives so much language to that, and labeling of things, and positive institutions is one of them, is yeah, like, so thinking about, yeah, how people can get involved in institutions that build them up. That's so
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah.
The decline of fraternal organizations over the last 20 to 25 years, I think really correlates with a lot of what we've talked about with increased work responsibilities and increased isolation. And I know there are folks out there doing good work on this in online spaces, trying to understand if the more accessible place I can drop into from my couch can be a replacement for the Elks or the Kiwanis or the men's group or whatever that might be.
Yeah. I I'm here for it. The there's that's the kind of, right, like, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of adaptability that can occur with that. And I really, yeah, like, I think men can rise to that occasion, and build those connections. Um, whether like video games, I like that's a really tremendous space. I was looking at the American Time Use survey, but like men, I think it's like that 18 to 25, or yeah, 25 age range, spend a little over an hour on average playing video games a day. Um,
Those are rookie numbers.
these are rookie numbers, yeah. um, TV people spend even more, but I do think, like, I think gaming is an amazing right space to be thinking about how can we make these connections like a little more meaningful, and start opening things up, in terms of, yeah, being more vulnerable, and deepening things. Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. Yeah.
So I want to just ask you one last question before we open this up to the group. So just practically, if we're concerned about a guy in their life that's navigating some kind of significant transition, like becoming a parent or changing careers or a loss of a loved one, what's the best way to go about supporting them and checking in with them and getting them to actually check in?
Yeah. Um, hmm. Well, I'm thinking of examples of people doing that, and I gotta see you do that really well over a couple of years, Dr. Cole, um, being a professor. It's about showing up. I think it's about being attentive. I don't know how much more there is to it. Following through, maybe it's following through, being consistent. I think those are secondary. Um, I think there's also, and this is just humans in general, but um, sharing, yeah, like, I've been through that, or I've been through something similar, and you're gonna find your way through it, and I'm here for you. Um, yeah, I think it's about showing up. I really do. I think it's about being attentive and showing up, um, asking questions about how people are, um, and man, like, building that, like, that raises my desire to be vulnerable with others, is knowing my sharing that could down the road help them out.
Mhm.
Practically, like a practical support way or emotional support way, kind of doesn't matter. Um, yeah, it's kind of I know that's kind of a shorter answer, Dr. Cole.
No, no, I think you hit on this idea though that it doesn't have to take a whole lot. It just takes being consistent and intentional. It doesn't have to be that you're saying the perfect thing or that you have the power to fix the problem. It's just being there and showing that you care enough to be there.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, never let the right answer get in the way of an answer. Like never let that get in the way. I that's something I've had to learn as a therapist, but it's true in daily life too. Um, yeah. I had a friend I was talking to the other night about. I was like, oh, I'm doing this interview with you, and I was like, oh, I'm a little nervous, and he ended up sharing with me. He's like, he's a beginning his career as a lawyer, and he said, when I get nervous and I'm about to go up, I like to imagine I'm in a World War II trench and I'm just coming out and I'm gonna make my run. And and it made me laugh. And I'll tell you, like, I don't think that's the right way to do it. But I'll tell you, he really did. I really did feel supported by him. And yeah, like man, sometimes I think about that Louis Armstrong quote of like there's friends shaking hands saying, how do you do? But they're really saying, I love you. And I think that's like, yeah, like I think that's what positive psych and like at this intersection, positive psych and masculinity can open up is allowing us to kind of hear the I love yous that guys say to each other. And I'll tell like for me, like that I love you, I heard from my friend even when he was talking about World War I churches for whatever reason. So,
That's a really, I think, powerful observation that, men may reach a point in certain relationships where it is totally safe and comfortable to say, I love you, and
yeah,
to really be vocal about how much you care. And then there are lots of other ways that men
yeah,
who can't quite go there show how much they do care for you and that they love you
yeah,
through
yeah,
acts of service or through just being there.
yeah, yeah, and yeah. As clinicians, as researchers, I think it's really about keeping like men's friendships deserves us keeping our eyes peeled for the good in it. Because that intimacy looks different, but it's often there. It's often there.
So I lied, and you made me think of one last question.
Go,
And
go,
it's just like
go.
really practical because you have such a passion for training new clinicians.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting down with a new clinician and they're working with maybe male clients for the first time or have very little experience with that, and they're trying to wrap their heads around friendships or they're trying to work through like how do I help them navigate relationships? Like what might be two or three things you would say to keep in mind for the new clinician based on what you said about how we only look for things that we know to exist?
You're talking about the good, and I want to go there so bad, but I think, like I said earlier about the like, I think understanding how policing of masculinity has impacted men developmentally, I think that's like that's so key. That's so key at the start. Um, I think it's about like one of the things I love to have an ear out for is is that the first time you've ever said that to a person?
Big
And
one.
when I sit with male clients, I'm like, that was new. And if your skill levels there, like taking that as a moment to process what that was like. What made you take like I see you like catch catch people. I love catching clients being good, catching kids being good, right? Um, I saw you being brave there, and you can tell me about that. Because that's something you're gonna want them to emulate outside of therapy. Um, I think, yeah, like I do this research on men's friendships for a reason. Um, be curious about all your clients' friendships, and I think in particular men's. Um, help them see the ways to deepen those friendships. Be ready to and challenge them to do that work. Yeah, those are kind of the things that come up to me for me. Yeah,
So gang, I think if you take even just one thing away from what Sam has shared with us, it's that idea of moving those social support and relationship questions off of the intake sheet and actually bringing them into the room in a real way and integrating them into the treatment plan and focusing on the whole client, not just the symptoms. So I have peppered you with enough questions. I want to open it up to the room. What questions do y'all have for Sam?
Well, I'll jump in if it's okay. First of all, Sam, I wanted to snaps for the Ted Lasso "Be Curious" call out. Could not be more agreement there. That's research. Actually, one thing that has come out for me that I was like 1,200 articles lit review. I'm like, all right, I gotta ask Sam this. A lot of times when we're talking about relationships and friendships, and particularly like male het friendships in this way, the focus is on you got to push past the awkwardness, you got to get past the anxiety and get to closeness and connection and contact. And I agree with all that 100%. And one of the frames that I take is a sort of steeped in an IPT address, which is the need to balance interdependence, which oftentimes we're all like, if I'm interdependent, I'm needy and I'm breaking the bro code and I'm doing that whole thing. But balancing the interdependence in close relationships with the need to also establish independence. And I find that the guys in particular really seem to struggle. It's kind of like all or nothing. It's like either we're like bros and we're hanging out, we're gonna go do this thing and this thing, and everything's cool, or I'm withdrawing. But the need to be able to sort of sometimes we're coming together and other times establishing a little bit of distance for folks that aren't necessarily that interpersonally facile. Like I'll see that as a real challenge. And I was curious, like, have you seen that as a clinician? Have you seen research on it? Anything?
Yeah. Wow, Danny, you put that really well. I think, yeah, like navigating that interdependence, independence thing is a major component of men approaching friendship. Clinically, I feel like I mostly see men who are really pretty disconnected. Um, uh, research wise, I feel like I haven't seen too much that talks about those as constructs. I think that's really interesting. Um, yeah. Um, there's literature about how men's friendship is changing, with regards to like gender norms in general, to heteronormativity, but kind of less along. I haven't seen much in terms of that dimension. Yeah.
One of the things that jumps out at me about that, though, too, is that there are a lot of opportunities to fail. And there's a lot of opportunity for shame to reinforce your isolation. So if I go into this and I need to be resilient and autonomous and stoic sometimes and connect other times, and I do that in a weird way, or I do that in a way that's not well received, or I just fall on my face, well, now I'm an even bigger failure because I took the risk and it didn't work. So now maybe I'm going to swing even further back into the isolation. So I think that's where the scaffolding and the support you talked about, and like calling out the bravery and just like being able to build guys up as
Yeah.
they try and fail and succeed is so
Yeah.
important.
Yeah, and I that's kind of what I'm trying to flesh out is with the football metaphor is like if your goal is that end, then I think your goal, if you're building from the ground up, needs to be thinking about getting sort of repetitions in, seeing people having enough of a connection that there's another meeting next time. I think that's probably where the focus should be for we should put focus as clinicians.
So breaking that down into smaller pieces rather than the all or nothing kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't have friends. The question should be, do you have acquaintances? Who are you curious about getting to know better? That I think that's kind of a good direction to go. Because like I mean, when I think about my friendships, it's we didn't get there day one, it took time.
Great. So a good question in the chat. I'm curious about your thoughts on how to foster male friends among adolescents. Any insights for clinicians on how to build them up despite being in this developmental stage where how people view you is so important?
Oh yeah. Oh, one of my favorite articles talks about kind of masculinity and kind of resisting norms of masculinity. The article is that Chu is the author, and I absolutely love that. Doesn't answer exactly this question, but it kind of talks about kind of protective factors around that. I, as a clinician, man, that's a great question, Taylor. I really appreciate it. I would want to open up their ideas about what makes them insecure about building friendships and connections. I want to hit on kind of for them, whatever kind of sense of autonomy they do have. I'd want to build that up. Yeah. I think being curious about their understanding of what friendship is, is a really good place to start as well. Yeah. Because a lot of, I don't know, I know you work with kids, Taylor, like sometimes it kind of turns out to be bullying. The friendship is not doesn't build them up. And that can be really, that can be really painful. Also can be a learning opportunity of trying to find something new. And so, yeah, being curious. I think building them up, I would want them to just be hopeful. And school does not, it doesn't last forever. Elementary school is just very, will end very soon. I want them to just be hopeful. Hopeful people make better connections. That's what the research shows. So, yeah.
Great. Any other questions for Sam?
You know I want to ask questions.
I
But
just watching you sit in there
well,
thinking about
the
it.
brilliant minds have already asked my go-to questions. I think that's really unfair. Sam, I want to ask you about training. I mean, you and I got to teach together intro skills. You already got asked about training. Dr. Cole asked you, you talked about that really beautifully. Taylor asked about adolescence. I'm sitting here thinking about how we help our clients raise boys, from the get-go to be in this mindset of friendship and be okay with friendship with other boys and, like be okay with being vulnerable and emotional and, the opposite of that kind of the toxic, the police, the messages that they're getting. So if you have more thoughts on any of that, I'm always curious if like if there's cultural aspects, like if there's pieces that you came across in your research or your reading that we need to be aware of, as clinicians, as trainers, to consider within the context of male friendships and just the nuance. I mean, there's just so many pieces and dynamics, um, and more of what surprised you.
Yeah.
So I broke my number one rule that we taught in skills to not ask more than one question at a time.
Yeah.
Um, but, any thoughts on any of that? I think my wheels always spin when you talk and when you share and when I see your passion and your excitement for what you're doing and what you hope to do. And I'm always thinking of more.
Okay. Let me try to answer some of those
Good
questions.
luck. I love
Um,
you.
I even in my work with men, I try to take kind of a feminist approach of where'd you learn that? Where do men learn that? How did it feel when you were learning that? Is that really, a lot of times, right? We know this about kind of identities that are associated with powers. There's often not a lot of reflection there. A lot of white men have not thought about their whiteness or their masculinity, and so doing that in a way that opens that up, I think those are really powerful questions to ask. The questions about culture. I have spent hours of my life looking at a breakdown of the American Time Use Survey article by Kahan, which breaks down different types of social support that folks get based on race. And we see that Latino folks tend to do it differently, spending a lot more time with what's categorized as non-household family members. And that by a pretty good sized margin. Additionally, the article as I mentioned to Taylor talks about how the strong relationships that young Latino boys, in some samples, have with sisters and their moms is a major protective factor of when it comes to resisting policing of masculinity and the adoption of masculine norms. That kind of work is just so powerful. Different men are getting different messages about what it means to be a man. And so, yeah, clinicians need to be very attentive of that all the time. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for your questions. And Sam, thank you so much for being here to share your expertise. I think we can all agree this is such a vitally important topic for the mental health of boys and men. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm so glad I had an opportunity